Good afternoon. I'm Tom Platt with the Washington chapter of the Society for Range Management. On behalf of the Washington chapter and the Pacific Northwest section, I welcome you to this quarterly webinar to be presented by Tip Hudson on his Art of the Range podcast. Tip is the Extension Range Specialist for Washington State University. He's based in Ellensburg, Washington. He's a past president of our chapter and currently director for the Society for Range Management. Many of you are familiar with his podcast. Today, he will speak about the brain science behind conversation for conservation. That's a tongue twister, Tip.
It's hard to get it out,
So,
isn't it?
with that, Tip, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you. I do see a few names that I don't know, which is a wonderful thing to have on a presentation with a new group. Yeah, it occurred to me today, actually, that I've been running the podcast since September of 2018. So I guess that means this completes the fourth full year. I think that's about right. And it was fun to go back and do some thinking on what my initial thoughts were behind why and how and what to do with the podcast. So we'll talk through some of that, and hopefully there'll be a little time for questions as well. I actually have to look sideways to see the screen that I've got the presentation on. So I'm going to start this, and then I'm going to stop my camera so you're not staring at the side of my face. Let's see. All right, are you seeing my actual slide?
Yes.
Okay. Probably a lot of people are aware that I actually grew up in Arkansas, in the Ozarks, in Oak Hickory Woodland, and I had done some internships with wildlife biologists working for the Corps of Engineers in Arkansas. The Corps built some pretty large dams that seemed to be the era for lots of dam construction. They built these for flood control primarily, and not initially for power generation, but of course they generate power. But because of the topography, Ozarks, when you build a dam and stop up a river, you create literally thousands of miles of shoreline with all these little draws in the hills that got flooded. So I had done some interning with the Corps of Engineers and a wildlife biologist, and I had the idea that I enjoyed thinking about habitat and how to manipulate habitat for whatever the target species was. In that case, it was game species through loss of any historical fire regime, as well as not much timber harvest in 100 years. There were some pretty tight forest stands and not enough feed for turkeys, and so they were doing some prescribed burning and seeding in places to generate stuff that turkeys would eat. So I came to the University of Idaho mostly because they had cheap out-of-state tuition and they had a strong wildlife program, and it seemed like an interesting place to come to from Arkansas. And I was introduced to rangeland ecology, which was not a term that I had heard of before, but this was more what I had in mind in the sense of integrating a lot of natural resource disciplines with on-the-ground management and not being too narrow. And that still mostly is what interests me in what has been my focus for the last 20 years with WSU in rangelands-based livestock production. And anybody who's listened to the podcast has probably heard me say a dozen times that I still think that rangelands-based livestock production is really the only method of food and fiber production that relies on naturally occurring plant communities and doesn't involve taking out whatever was there before. I think there's a natural synergy between ecology and economy that is unique here, and I think it's important for us to do it well and to tell those stories. But my job as a range extension faculty is to help people whose livelihoods depend on doing that well to do a good job at it. And the older I get, the more I'm motivated by caring for people and not just focusing on land, not just because people matter, but because the only way we're going to take care of the land is through people making decisions in real time. Well, a group of us, 6 or 7 years ago, a group of us at WSU had gotten a grant from the Climate Hub to produce some short film documentaries of ranches that were managing rangelands for what we ended up calling resilience to climate uncertainty. And part of our idea behind this was that in doing some literature review and thinking through what we needed to promote, we were convinced that these are what we called no regret strategies, meaning the things that you would do in terms of managing rangeland to maximize resilience, both resilience to change and resistance to shifting from one stable state to an undesirable stable state, are things that people would be doing anyway. In other words, regardless of what anybody thinks about the climate and whether and how it's changing, these things are all good ideas, and they have, at a minimum, they help us to deal with the known variability from year to year in precipitation and forage that's characteristic of most of the semi-arid West. So we did a short film on Jack Southworth. Maybe some of you have seen these, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself. Jack Southworth down in Central Oregon, down by Seneca. Russ and Ryan Stingley over here in Ellensburg, and then a family down in the Owyhees that have been doing some work with the BLM, specifically with rural fire protection associations, and those were a fun project. But in interviewing the ranchers for these short films, because my job on the team was to be asking the questions and try to explore different ideas. You ask a question, but then based on their responses to that, you follow those rabbit trails as long as you keep finding useful information, and that's kind of the style of these exploratory interviews. And it seemed to me that the exploration of this topic, or whatever the topic might be, together was a lot more enlightening than me trying to analyze something on my own. And in traveling to the locations for these, sometimes with another person in the vehicle, I realized I listened to a fair bit of stuff that's news or books on tape, and it made me wonder, is there something out there that would be interesting and useful on range science or management? And so I did some searching. Again, this was a full 4 years ago, and it didn't find much. So I thought a podcast that recorded conversations on rangeland topics might be, one, a fun thing to do. Two, could be more effective at addressing what I felt like I saw as the primary risks in ranching, which are complex, than traditional information delivery. And part of the idea here is that solutions to complex problems require understanding local biological and social and economic context. And those solutions we get at through doing mental labor. So I did get a grant from the Western Center for Risk Management to start the podcast, and have operated on additional grants from the Western Center and some other donations since then. The Society for Range Management and the Rangelands Partnership, which is a group of Western Extension range professionals and agricultural librarians, have been project partners, but not funders, at least not to this point. Well, one of the big ideas here was that ranchers in national surveys, regional surveys, consistently identify sociological and regulatory risks as the most significant and unpredictable and uncontrollable risks to a ranching business. And in fact, most of those surveys came after an address at a Rangelands Partnership event that I heard from Nathan Sayre, who many people will know as a geographer from UC Berkeley. But he said in this 2005 meeting, the threats to ranching today are not fundamentally ecological ones. The forces arrayed against it are economic and social in nature. And that's really what keeps people up at night. Those risks can't be adequately addressed through a financial planning workshop, although there's benefit in doing things like that. But the problem is that these sociological problems are bigger than that, and the edges of the kind of these problems are not sharp edges. But sort of like in state and transition models, it's easier to prevent crossing that threshold than it is to recover from it. Once a ranch has snowballed with operating loans and feel like they can't get out of debt, oftentimes that's past the point of no return. So in scientist speak, we might say that these social and regulatory risks have to be addressed by continual adaptive management toward ecological and economic resilience. But those words really don't communicate very well the amount of work that it takes to translate the mashup of all those concepts into daily decisions. So successful adaptation with these, this wicked learning environment and really complex problems does require building mental and social skills that increase your ability to respond creatively and constructively to the social and ecological challenges. And it's now an entire genre of literature and research that this mental resiliency is being challenged in our modern era. Thomas Friedman, who's a pretty well-known New York Times journalist, called our time the age of interruption, capital A and a capital I. That was in 2006. There was also a former Microsoft executive who, back about the same time frame, described the dominant thinking pattern among modern cultures today as continuous partial attention. And brain scientists have shown that the human brain is really plastic, meaning that according to a neuroscientist, George Mason, said the brain has the ability to reprogram itself on the fly, altering the way it functions. And in fact, this is even described by what's come to be known as Hebb's rule. Cells that fire together wire together, meaning that we can gain and lose specific kinds of mental abilities depending on what we do with our brains. But unfortunately, I think scattered thinking and the ability to concentrate, which are the two most common effects of this continuous partial attention, is probably just the tip of the iceberg. There was a really good book that I read a few years ago by Sherry Turkle, who has been a social scientist at MIT for about 40 years. And she was hired to study the effects of computers on people. And she wrote a book. Let's see, the book was Reclaiming Conversation. She's written several books, but the most recent one was Reclaiming Conversation. And in that book, she argues that a more serious long-term result of saturation in modern media, of being hyper-connected with devices that are always on and always on you, is not just scattered thinking, but what she describes as a precipitous loss of empathy for fellow humans. So on the one hand, there's nothing new under the sun, but I would also argue that the volume of the rancor and the antipathy and the social conflict, at least as it plays out in the news and in local communities right now, is deafening, and it's in a way that I think a lot of people feel is not exactly safe anymore. And that antipathy really is agnostic to political party, age, gender, ethnicity, occupation, you name it. And This is really interesting. For those who have been members of the SRM for a long time, I think I wrote something about this uh, over a decade ago. But we make people are often critical of philosophy, feeling like philosophy is not useful. It's touchy-feely. It's all abstract. But philosophy is intended to deal with what ought to be. Science answers some questions of what is, identifying causality, and so scientists are often prone to shun anything that sounds philosophical because it seems like it's unscientific. But uh, underneath the what I would say is the desensitization of resulting from media saturation, we're also swimming in the worldview of utilitarianism, which says that people are just matter in motion and don't really have any intrinsic value. Now, most of us don't operate that way, but you can feel this, and I think we see the effects of it. And most of us would argue against it, but without really any rational basis for that. Well, this is what I think is interesting. For a long time, Tad Box, who was a longtime professor at Utah State, had a essentially a regular column in the Rangelands Journal, and he wrote an article titled "Carrying Capacity, Trade-offs, and a Land Ethic." And in the article, he praises a Japanese, you know, an old Japanese film from about 1984 called "The Ballad of Mount Narayama" that took awards at the Cannes Film Festival in Australia. And the film portrays an indigenous tribe in Japan that takes its elderly people when they're about 70 years old up on the top of a mountain to die of exposure so that they're not a burden to the young people. It also portrays them stuffing infants into the snow to kill them if the village thinks it has too many people. And Dr. Box, who I've met and is a congenial, warm fellow, praised the film in this article and the practices and said that represents the unavoidable conclusion of applying what he called an ecological ethic, a new way of defining right and wrong, promoted by the term I think was promoted by Aldo Leopold, who's everybody's hero. You can't argue with Aldo Leopold. But so in a scientific journal, Dr. Box was openly advocating for geronticide and infanticide in the interest of avoiding exceeding our carrying capacity. And that's not a mischaracterization of what he had to say. Do scientific facts drive us there? I would say not. That's a philosophical statement that is not the only option on the table. And we still have some freedom of speech. And I believe that we need to have these discussions of what ought to be, not just what is, inside the camp, and be willing to have it out, just talk about things that are difficult to talk about. But in the middle of that, I think we tend to forget that mere information is not wisdom. Those of us who are in the scientific community like to think that if we just give somebody else the same facts that we have access to, that they'll make the same decision about those facts as we would. But that is never the case. In extension, we like to talk about lifelong learning, which means in part that we assume that we never fully arrive, that there's always something more to learn. And I would say that after 25 years of thinking through these things, I have a lot fewer pat answers than I did 25 years ago. But I think that's the beginning of wisdom and not the end of it. There's a good quote that I've used in a couple different contexts, and so forgive me if you've heard it, but one of the books that made me think about these things a little bit more seriously was Nicholas Carr's book, The Glass Cage, which speaks of well, I think the subtitle is The Social Cost of Automation. And he's describing kind of the history of technological development. And he describes what happens when we give up the ability to think. He says, if we're not careful, the automation of mental labor, by changing the nature and focus of intellectual endeavor may end up eroding one of the foundations of culture itself, which is our desire to understand the world, and I would say each other. He continues, predictive algorithms may be supernaturally skilled at discovering correlations, but they're indifferent to the underlying causes of traits and phenomena. Yet, it is the deciphering of causation, the meticulous untangling of how and why things work the way they do in the real world, that extends the reach of human understanding and ultimately gives meaning to our search for knowledge. If we come to see automated calculations of probability as sufficient for our professional and social purposes, we risk losing or at least weakening our desire and motivation to seek explanations, to venture down the circuitous paths that lead toward wisdom and wonder. It's a bit long, but I do like that quote. So the idea behind a conversational podcast with a recorded interview that is somewhat long, I feel like it's a little bit like long form audio journalism, is to venture down those circuitous paths. Obviously, in a podcast, there's only two of us engaged in back and forth conversation, but conversation is important because it's really powerful. Conversation is the most human thing we do as humans. It also strengthens the brain because it requires you to single task, or at least it ought to, which is doing one thing with focus for an extended period of time where your brain is fully engaged on that one thing. And that is becoming pretty rare. But psychologists will also say that conversation promotes what has been called the generation effect, which is where your brain takes in information and digests it and then makes synthetic conclusions from it. So my goal with a podcast interview is not to give people bullet points. And I always tell interviewees that the goal is not to deliver a bunch of tightly scripted talking points, but literally to have a conversation and to find useful things that we wouldn't have encountered unless we were just talking through stuff and follow that. And we want to stimulate the quality of thinking that generates that in people who are listening as well. Because the sorts of conclusions that you make when your brain is operating in this flow state where you're having this generation effect, those conclusions, those answers to landscape and social problems are more accurate and relevant and contextually valid. Fred Provenza had a pretty good article about this. I think it was in Rangelands a number of years ago. But he said that the process of creating in science and practice is enabled through dialogue, which is the free flow of ideas among peoples of diverse backgrounds. Don Nelson, who was WSU's extension beef specialist for many years, who's since passed away, loved to say that we don't know what we don't know. Meaning there are things that are known unknowns, but one of the only ways to get to the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know, is through conversation. And the interview with Fred Provenza, which I think was episode number 4, is one of my favorite. And we just re-released that one, which is the first time I've ever done a rerun. But I needed to buy some time because I didn't have anybody lined up. And I've heard from a lot of people that were more recent listeners that have never gone back and heard some of the early stuff. So Fred Provenza is a good thinker, and I really liked that episode. Just one more thought on philosophy here. Most of us in the post-Enlightenment age really do think that we are thinking things, which is what Rene Descartes had put forth. We are thinkers, but again, our rational analysis doesn't drive our every thought and move. Our ability to think abstractly does separate us from the rest of the animal kingdom, but our actions still are driven by what we love, by a vision of the good life, and we're always moving and living toward those things that attract us, which isn't always the result of rational analysis of what somebody's calling facts. So it's important to give some thought to how we shape what we love. Another quote that I've used several times is because I really like it. There was a musician from ancient Greece who said a long time ago, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws." Meaning we're going to live out the things that we're attracted to that are sort of underneath the level of rational thought. So my main point here is that people are persuaded to action more by an appeal to shared values rather than scientific fact transfer. So there's some, I think, simple take-home messages here that do represent a convergence of brain science and philosophy and common sense, and I would say good range science. Talk to people, talk to your neighbor, take the time to sit down and actually look at somebody when you're not scrolling through your Facebook feed and have a real conversation. And attending to the person who's in front of you is not as easy as it sounds. Uh, my wife and I have homeschooled our children, and I'll still frequently get to the end of a day and realize that I didn't make eye contact, with a particular child all day long. And most of the time I'll rectify that. But then, after you've talked to somebody, instead of watching the news, which you can't do anything about anyway, go do something that's good for your brain. Go fishing, build something, read a good book, go for a walk, and your brain will thank you. Some of the challenges in doing a podcast, well, I guess the first one is that for all this talk about conversation, there's obviously no two-way conversation with people who are listeners of a podcast. So one, you don't know who's listening. There's no way to find that out unless you ask them to identify themselves to you through email somehow. You don't really know how many listeners there are. The only statistics that I get back are how many times a particular episode has been played or downloaded. And of course, the most listened to episode would be getting somewhere close to the total number of listeners. But it's kind of hard to characterize the audience. Not just that you don't know who they are, you sort of know vaguely where they are, but you also don't know what kind of a person they are. Is this person a undergraduate range student? Is it a rancher in Utah? Is it a professor, a conservation district employee? And of course, the answer is yes to all of those, but you don't really know how many of each one. It's also more difficult than I would have anticipated to get stuff lined up for release, to have a few episodes in the can so that you've kind of got it staggered out. It's tough to get ahead of that curve. I've also found that some people object to podcast content, and I guess my goal is to be an equal opportunity offender, and I'm trying to avoid anything that I think is snake oil. And I've actually, turned away some interviewees that approached me because they were trying to market something. So I'm definitely interested in feedback if people feel like something was out of line or uncalled for. But I also think we just need to have some space to have these conversations out loud instead of backbiting behind the scenes. I've also discovered that the episodes that get listened to the most are the ones where some other organization that had an interest was actively promoting it. And holy cow, my thing is not marketing and promotion. I've fought with how to maintain a listserv on MailChimp where people send you their email addresses and then you send stuff out periodically. And I'm going to have to spend a little more time on that because 4 years in, I still haven't figured out how to do any kind of active email marketing. One of the challenges is trying to figure out long-term funding. I have been successful at running grants to pay for this, and for anybody who's interested, the main cost is paying for an audio technician over in Pullman at WSU to crunch all of the audio and build the stuff in the background. So I'm using my time to identify interviewees and topics and develop the content, but somebody else is managing the technical side of editing audio and trying to do quality control. And that plus transcription costs a fair bit of money. There's some problems with doing ads, and I really don't want to do paid ads. I'm not interested in recording a 30-second spot on Mack Weldon underwear. But that begs the question of, how do you fund a podcast? Do you just ask for donations where there's no strings attached? That's a possibility. Let's see. This is not advancing. Listenership has gone up pretty steadily. This is the number of monthly listens, unique listens, going back to the start of the thing. And it seems like we have kind of hit a high point and then plateaued, which tells me that I need to be reaching out to a newer public that is not already exposed. And I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. Interestingly, I did get some data from a survey. The survey only had about 100 responses, and I think based on the most listened to episodes, there's somewhere around 3,500 listeners total, which isn't exactly viral. But for the people that listen, it seems to be meaningful. That survey, which I'm certain was biased toward folks that are not ranchers, ended up with this rough approximation of demographics. I think actual listenership is about a third ranchers, and then 2/3, various flavors of natural resource professionals. And that's information you can't get out of a podcasting platform. At the time that I did the survey, which was about 2 years ago, there was a pretty large percentage that said they'd listen to everything that's ever been on the podcast. And 4 out of 5 people said that listening caused them to take some kind of action, to do something differently than they've been doing it before, which is encouraging. I'm not going to read through all of these, but because this is a Western Center for Risk Management funded project to this point, one of the questions is, have the actions that you took had any kind of economic value to your operation? And I'd like to see higher numbers, but I also suspect this is an honest accounting of how people feel about it, which is that some say, yeah, I think so, and a pretty large number say maybe, and about half people say, no, I think there's benefits, but I wouldn't call them economic benefits. One of the things that really was interesting was this question about how many acres the listeners' management has some sway over. And when I initially ran the survey, I had 50,000 plus as the largest category. But there was something like 70% of respondents that clicked the 50,000 plus answer. So that told me if I'm going to distinguish among different size groups, I'm going to have a bigger size group. So even with a revised survey where greater than 1 million acres was one of the options, we still had 15% of survey respondents say that they manage their thinking and their influence extends across more than 500,000 acres. If I tend to extrapolate based on the survey size, the number of respondents and these categories out to the listening audience, this is obviously an internal exercise for my own reporting to the mothership of whether or not I think this is doing any good. But if the survey results are anywhere close to approximating actual listenership and management sizes, then it could have an impact. I think that was all the slides. Yeah, I'll leave it there for a minute. And if anybody has not listened before, you can get to the website using that QR code. But we can also just have some discussion since we don't have a gigantic group. And I'll turn my camera back on.
Fascinating tip. Thank you. Describe again the the demographic of those who did respond to your survey: ranchers, agency people, professional people.
Yeah, that was this slide. Maybe I had too many categories in there to answer to, but I wanted to try to get a little finer scale accounting of what kind of person is listening. And in my mind, these are all pretty distinctive types of people. So I guess I was pleasantly surprised that that there was this broad of a representation.
Did you ask people when or how they listened? To me,
I think I
that's
did. Yeah, there were a number of questions in the survey that I didn't attempt to include in the presentation, but I think the vast majority of them heard about it through the Society for Range Management, and some an email or a newsletter or something that came through the SRM.
And what was their? I assume most people don't just sit down and listen; they're doing something else. Did you ask about that?
No, I have just sort of some informal, anecdotal data that comes back from people that the vast majority are listening while they're driving,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which was what I suspected. That's the only time that I listen to podcasts. I never listen to anything when I'm at my desk because I'm doing something else.
Right. Right. What about coming up with topics? Do you struggle with that, or do you have more than you can handle?
No, there's no end of topics, and that was one reason why I thought I could do a podcast because I figured I could release something every 2 weeks for the rest of my life, and we would still never exhaust all the topics that are relevant to rangeland ecology and livestock production. And that has been my experience. One of the things that has been humbling is that in the course for a grant application, you've got to promise some deliverables. And on the first go around, I attempted to promise specific topics for each episode, 26 per year. And I found that that was not so easy to achieve. And so in the second grant, I identified topic areas, with some intended outcomes from people listening to that, and that was a little bit more reasonable. But what I found is that the stuff that ends up on the podcast is quite a bit more opportunistic than planned. There are obviously there's plenty of planned stuff. If anybody's been listening recently, the current grant is a different uh, a different block of grants for producers underserved by crop insurance, and it's got a focus on ranch financial health. And so there's been a lot of stuff on ranch financial planning, which is not my cup of tea, and I think that probably comes through in the interviews. But the other stuff that's there tends to be much more opportunistic. I become aware of something useful, and we run it. Like the episode that released this morning is an interview with James and Barbara Camp, which are the managers for a big cattle station in northwestern Australia. I happened to be there a couple weeks ago for the Australian Rangeland Society, and in fact, this photograph was taken from their front porch. That's the sun coming up at about 5:40 a.m. And when it comes up, it just shoots out of the horizon. But I had a recorder with me and decided to interview them because they have a really interesting story about exporting live red Brahman cattle to Indonesia and managing large landscapes where they don't own the land, but they've got a 100-year lease from the government, to run cows on this uh, cattle station that gets traded among billionaires about every decade or so. And I figured it'd be a good story. And lots and lots of episodes are like that, where I become aware of something that sounds really interesting and I chase it down.
you have any help researching topics and convincing people to let you interview them?
No, I have a couple times had to do a little bit of work to convince someone to be interviewed. I'm actually surprised. I don't like being on camera, but for whatever reason, I don't mind being behind a microphone. And but I'm surprised when people who I consider to be, have uh, a lot better credentials and long track record of being in the public eye in terms of rangeland science and being a public advocate for rangelands. I've run into some of those people who really are nervous about being interviewed. It does help to reduce some of that potential anxiety in that we're recording something that's then going to be edited and posted later. It's not like a live radio broadcast, which would be a whole different thing. But, we can, I don't know if anybody's on who's been interviewed, but, we'll often kind of pause and regroup and think about, what we want to talk about or how we want to finish up, or, is there something that you want to talk about that I didn't ask about yet? And so it's pretty flexible in that way and removes some of the stress, I think, for people.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Tip. And I will say I enjoyed your first initial episodes, and then life happened, and I found less time available to listen to them. I tried listening to them while doing other things, and was very dissatisfied because it's a conversation, and I really wish to mentally participate as an active listener, although I can't
Yeah.
say anything. So I'm afraid my participation has dropped considerably over the past year or three. So I guess that speaks to me needing to carve out some personal time for podcasts. And I find as I'm driving, it's not a good idea for me to be listening to something that's going to take my attention off the road.
Mm.
It gets scary. Anyway, I wanted to throw something out that is rather philosophical in nature, in terms of what is a fact and what do we think we know, and why so many of us see the same thing and see things differently. And I think part of a large part of it is we have grown up with and developed through our experiences filters and ways of looking at things that color what we observe.
Mm-hmm.
And even the act of observing sometimes changes what is seen. And so many of our facts are based on not exactly what it was observed, but what is interpreted from what is observed. And
Mm-hmm.
those are often true, certainly true for the person who developed them. But oftentimes, as you mentioned, maybe that 1% can enlighten things incredibly in a slightly different direction. That's all.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think that's absolutely the case. Just a funny example. My oldest son, who is 23, has been living at home for a couple months because he's working for a company here in Ellensburg, and he began dating a girl in Spokane for the first time he's ever dated in his life, just about a couple weeks ago. And he was telling my wife and I about these initial encounters when they were together with a group of friends, including two of my daughters who live there where David is in Spokane. And as he's describing the weekend with this group of friends doing some stuff together, he was describing action, and And my wife eventually said, "You said lots and lots about what she was doing. You were going canoeing, and then you were teaching her how to drive a stick shift, and then you guys were making food together in the kitchen. But what did she say?" She was interested in what was the dialogue, and his telling of the story was almost entirely based on the actions that they were doing, and then his interpretations of the conversation and what he thought it meant, or a paraphrase of what somebody said. And it's just a different perspective. We all see a different side or a different chunk of the elephant. And I do think one of the only ways that we see the whole elephant is by, learning to see through each other's eyes and getting a different perspective. And you only do that through conversation.
Totally agree. And even if he were to repeat the conversation that he remembers hearing from his
Right.
girlfriend,
It wouldn't be the actual conversation. Not even close.
Tip, what haven't you discussed that you'd like to share with us?
I probably do have some questions. I am interested in, I've had a couple suggestions from folks that it might be fun to do like a listener call in and have some discussion. It wouldn't be difficult to do. The platform that we use, I didn't talk about the nuts and bolts of this thing, but the platform that we use for recording is called Zencaster, which is it's a web-based program that sets up a voice over IP call like a Zoom meeting between however many people want to be on. But then it records a high definition local audio file and writes it to your hard drive while you're talking, so that the quality of the audio is only dependent on your hardware, not on the connection, not on the internet connection. It works pretty well in that you can, as long as somebody's got a decent microphone, we do collect pretty nice, clean audio. But it also means we could have 10 or 15 people on at the same time, and you could have a kind of a group discussion. The way to do that, I suppose, would be to advertise the recording time in an episode, or if I knew that, say, 5 of you wanted to participate, and I know of a handful of other people who would be interested in participating, then we could just schedule it and we could call it a listener call in, even though you've all been invited. That's a possibility, sort of a Q&A thing. I'm also interested in what people think about funding mechanisms. The direct costs for the direct cost probably per episode or somewhere in the order of about $400. We pay about $70 to $90 for transcription service, and then there's a couple $300 involved in audio technician time to crunch the stuff. So I've flirted with the idea of something like a Patreon account where people, if they like what they hear, they can donate $10 a month or whatever, just to be a contributor and find some long-term funding. Because at the moment, if I run out of grant money, there's not a whole lot more to go on. We've actually sort of half officially started an agreement with the Idaho Rangelands Commission to do about half of the episodes in 2024 will be stuff related to what the Idaho Rangelands Commission has done in their Life on the Range video series. So and they're paying for that. So we'll take the people who were part of these short films and interview them about the content, and use that sort of in cross purposes. One, it'll give them access to people that haven't seen the films, but it also gives me access through their email list to people that haven't before listened to the podcast. So I think that'll be fruitful, and there'll be some new stuff there. It also means that leaves, only 12 or 14 episodes where I've got more freedom to define the content. So anyway, I'm looking for some funding. There seems to be some problems with the university in doing advertising. I actually tried to do some sponsored episodes and found that evidently was a conflict of interest, at least according to the university AG. So we'll avoid that. I think the deal is, whatever I do for funding, it has to not have strings attached unless it's something like a contract to deliver specific content.
So funding, it seems to me, Tip, that what you're doing is, especially ranging from the rangelands of North America to Australia to who knows where, in the future. And that you're especially you're talking about a conversation of, between lots of people. It's not that we're trying to persuade anybody necessarily to change from being a vegetarian to becoming, aficionado, but to help people from many walks of life, urban, suburban, rural, have a better understanding of what goes into
Mm-hmm.
ranching and range management. That being said, with that kind of a focus caveat, I don't know how you want to put it, framework, I would think, not that any of our range associations are flush with money, but it sure seems to me that the P&W section could, if it felt flush enough, could donate a couple hundred shekels to the cause. I would think SRM, as Parent Society, you're providing
Yeah.
quite a good service from the sociological and educational perspective.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I think some of that it may be in the offing. I'm planning to do a series in 2024 on the 6 different ecosystem services categories defined by this recent SRM report that we had the intro piece with Jeff Goodwin and Lauren Prensky on. And the SRM is likely going to pay for those episodes because it's promoting their report. I also think, to one of your earlier comments, that telling more of these stories, like James and Barbara Camp, on a remote cattle station in Australia, has interest to the general public. It's not just applied science that's meant for rangeland practitioners. And so I'm trying to, I think I'm going to try to blend content like that tells stories that would be of interest to the general public, as well as continuing with some applied science that is more of interest to people that are actually managing rangelands. And I think that broader exposure will also help potentially attract some additional funding.
And Tip, what about underwriting from individuals and foundations and the business community? What would WSUs take beyond that?
Yeah, that's what I think I'm calling a donation. If
Yeah.
somebody wants to just, I've got an account set up for the podcast with WSU, somebody can just write a check to that account. I think what they were objecting to was a sponsored episode where they're clearly getting something back that has value to them, and they're putting a dollar figure on that. And there's some conflict of interest there because it's not just open to anybody. I'm selecting who those sponsored episodes are going to be. Whereas if you open it up and say, if you support the work of the Auto Range podcast, contact me or the development officer at Pullman about supporting it with a donation. I don't think that would be a conflict.
And tell us about an example of one of your favorite episodes.
Yeah. I mentioned that Fred Provenza was one of them just because he's somebody that I've read, and I feel like he has quite a bit of breadth as well as depth. and I really enjoyed talking with Fred. Now that I think about that, I'm not so sure that I'm not biased for the episodes where I recorded in person, because the episode with Fred I actually recorded at his place near Ennis, Montana a few years ago, uh, when I happened to be passing that direction for a couple of other purposes. And that makes a difference. It obviously colors what I think about it. I would have said that this episode with James and Barbara Camp was also interesting. It was interesting because the topic was interesting, but I also never would have met them if I hadn't been there for the ARS meeting. And then John Taylor was working with somebody local to try to set up a ranch visit, but never would have found him. I might have been able to get to somebody and do a remote interview about a place that I'd never seen before, and it would be totally different. Yeah, I'm trying to think what other episodes have been a favorite one and why. I also like interviews where the interviewee doesn't require me peddling them too hard to get them to say something. I've had a few occasions where, you'll ask a question that's meant to be a leading question to get into something, and I'll get a one sentence answer, and then you just got to work it all the way to the end, as opposed to somebody who's got some ideas that they want to talk about, and you're providing a venue for them to go after it, and we'll go back and forth in conversation. But if you have to work too hard to get it out, one, it feels like the person isn't really that interested in what we're doing, and that's not very motivating either as an interviewer.
Other questions or comments from the audience?
I am interested in suggestions for either people or for topics, and that can just, I don't know if I had I don't think my email address was on that final slide, but yeah, I'm easy to find. The email is hudsont@wsu.edu. I can throw it in the chat, but I'm interested in, I don't know everybody out there. I know enough people and enough topics to keep me going for years and years, but other people are going to know of stuff that would be worth airing, that I won't encounter unless somebody lets me know about it. I don't know if I can't quite see the participant list, but I'm trying to get to Hugh Barrett to talk about his history with work with the BLM and riparian science. It's an example of one that I've kind of been, working on, talking back and forth with him for a while, and it's one that I'd like to do in person, but I just haven't had occasion to. He's not on the way to anywhere in Ocean Shores.
Well, we'll be close to Hugh for our early summer meeting next year, Tip. So that might provide an opportunity to get
Yeah. together. Yeah. So
Tip,
if you have ideas for topics or interviewees, shoot me an email or give me a call.
Well, thank you for a fascinating conversation about the art of range and the brain science behind it. Thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you, the participating audience. I would like to mention that our next webinar is scheduled for November 8th at 3 p.m. That's a Wednesday. And this is a webinar that we postponed earlier in the season by Craig Madsen, the soil sponge and ecological function. And we're not scheduled for anything into the early next year, but as Tip asked, if you have ideas, let us know. And you can drop a comment through our website at pnwsrm.org. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll have it posted in a few days. And you can find that on the Washington chapter of SRM's YouTube channel or at pnwsrm.org. And then you just select the publications and media menu item. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Tip. Thank you again.
Thanks, Tom.